This morning, I have somebody who is very important in my life, who is here who's here with us this morning to bring this morning's message to you all. This is John Brolley, who is the director of at least 3 different programs at the University of Cincinnati. I'll let him go over some of that background, but the specific thing I wanted to say to you before I let him get up and speak is that he was a person who helped me to create my undergraduate degree. I ended up getting a Bachelor of Interdisciplinary Studies at the University of Cincinnati, which then eventually led me to seminary and eventually through lots and twists and turns to be your pastor here today. But John was in particular important at a time when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do in my young life and what was going to be my next step in a challenging moment in my life. And he was very influential in encouraging me not only to study things that were interesting in my mind and in my heart, but also to do it in ways that worked for me, not just ways that fit what other people defined. And so he is a person who I think classically fits beyond the definition of teacher into a person who's truly an educator of young people, especially people in college age. And so I was privileged after I became your minister here to reconnect with him, because one of the people who regularly worships with us and worship Deanna's husband, Jerry Reed, who unfortunately is sick today and is not able to be with us, but is also a professor down at the University of Cincinnati and happens to be friends with John. And when he told John I got this new young pastor and he mentioned my name, John was like, I remember that name. And so through Jerry, I reconnected with John. I've been doing lunches with him every couple months with him and Jerry down at UC. And it's been a privilege to get reconnected with him now. And so he is here to speak with you all today, and I hope you all will give him a warm welcome. Thank you.
Okay. The scripture readings for today come from Exodus and Matthew. And I can see in the program that if you wish to follow the Exodus passage in your pew Bibles, it'll start on page 54. And I am reading from the New International Version, so there shouldn't be any sort of disconnect or concern. You'll notice as you follow along, it's on the screen. I feel so Joel Osteen all of a sudden. This passage is a portion of the 10 Commandments, but it is not the opening portion. It actually kicks in about midway, and what you'll see when we get to Matthew is there's a reason for this. So, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his manservant or maidservant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Bless you. And moving along to Matthew. This is the 5th chapter, and we're going to skip around a little bit, the 21st and 22nd. I don't need to tell you this. It's page 684. And you'll notice, if you read these 2 passages side by side, that when Jesus offers his commentary upcoming on the 10 Commandments, he actually starts with the murder clause. He does not offer commentary on the opening 4 or 5 commandments. He starts right with the second portion, which seem to have a lot more to do with the way humans relate to one another. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother, raka, which is an Aramaic term kind of meaning like chucklehead, is answerable to the Sanhedrin, which is a council of Jewish leaders. But anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Moving to the 27th verse. You have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. So first of all, greetings from Kentucky, a planet not unlike your own. And I and my wife Teresa and our daughter Maria are just so fortunate to be here. I know you feel fortunate to be working with Tyler. I know from our luncheons that he is very fortunate to be here, and he feels that way. I'll just say real briefly that way back when, and I'm going to say this is probably about 15 years ago, give or take, back when Tyler had, less hair and I had more. We could tell right off the bat in our program that this was an exceptional young man with a keen intellect and a really wonderfully sort of rooted yet inquiring faith and spirit. And it's always been it was a pleasure to work with him, and it's a pleasure to reconnect with him now. And even more of a pleasure because we're here with you. And I also want to say thank you for coming, because I was ready for the type of attendance we get towards this moment in the school year, which is about a third of what I'm seeing. So thank you. This is not a super Adventy, Christmassy type of sermon, so I apologize for that, but I hope you will find it of some use because we're going to work together on it. As you know from Tyler's introduction, I speak a lot in public, but typically not in pulpits. More often I'm in the classroom. I was in 2 of them just this Friday, 2 days ago. So if you really want to make me feel more at home, I would suggest the first third of you just pull out your phones right now and start texting or checking whatever outstanding bids you have on eBay or whatever, or Instagram. The middle third, you don't have to do anything until about 2 minutes before we finish, at which point I recommend you just grab a hymnal or something else and just drop it loudly. And the last third, just take a nap. The music will kick in. You'll know enough to kind of get back up and act like you've been here the whole time. But seriously, I do love what I do at UC, and I also love this opportunity to share some time analyzing the Bible with you. And one of the first courses I ever taught at the University of Cincinnati was a New Testament survey. And I do this thing, and Tyler will bear witness to this. I do this thing before every course I teach where I go down the list of people on the roster so that I memorize their first names. I've always felt it was important, no matter how large the class, to be able to call students by name from the very first night. And I remember the first time I taught this New Testament course, I'm going to say 15 or more years ago, there was a name on there, and in those days we didn't have ID photos in the roster. So I saw the name, I'm like, I know this guy. I don't know how I know this guy, but I know this guy. And I sort of just made sure I memorized the name. I didn't worry about it. And I got to class that night, and these were in the days when classes we could actually do some kind of icebreakers. It was evening college, and there weren't a ton of students there. And so a little bit about yourself, and this gentleman raises his hand, and the little bit he shared about himself is that he was the dean of UC's College of Engineering. So, yeah, no pressure there. And he had his own Bible and knew it very well, so more no pressure there. And I remember we actually discussed this passage from Matthew where Jesus refers to a couple of the 10 Commandments and then says, you've been told not to murder, but I'm telling you, if you even have anger in your heart, you are liable for some incredibly harsh judgment. And you've been told not to commit adultery, but I tell you, if you even think in an adulterous manner, inappropriately, lustfully, you're already, now you are liable to this harsh judgment. And I said, what do you make? Do you have some questions about this passage? And the dean of engineering raises his hand. And in that typical sort of, engineering, I'm not going to use very concise, very to the point. And he goes, John, this sure strikes me as though Jesus is being pretty gosh darn hardcore here. And that was like his whole thing. I'm like, okay. And, the rest of the class, I could see their heads kind of perk up when he said that, probably because only 2 or 3 of them had done the reading. but also because this was hardcore wasn't a term that they were used to hearing applied to Jesus. And so from that moment, the discussion really centered on, was Jesus really going so far beyond the legal and ethical message of the Ten Commandments that we would refer to him as hardcore? Well, that's what you and I are going to talk about today. What I'd like us to do to make that work is to assume two or three things together, okay? First of all, and I say this because in my field this is a matter of debate sometimes, and I would like it not to be a matter of debate today. Let's assume that Matthew is not offering us what we might call fake news, that this is an accurate account, that historically speaking, Jesus actually said these things. Let's also assume that Jesus isn't just goofing on his disciples, that he doesn't give them this sort of shocking piece of advice and then kind of walks away going, I got him now. Who's your Messiah? That type of thing. And let's also assume that Jesus is not setting his followers up then or now for failure, that he is not giving us guidelines for living that will frustrate us and ultimately doom us to some sort of failure. That is not what Jesus would do with his followers then or now. And I wrestled with this. After that night, I have wrestled for this for the better part of a decade and a half. And then I realized something that I would like to bring to you so that you can work with this passage productively instead of being frustrated or concerned about it. What Jesus is doing here is a time-honored Jewish scholarship move. And it's called the fence around the Torah. Or if you're not in the mood to do the 25-cent Hebrew tour, a fence around the law. In this case, Jewish law. And in order to understand that and explain what I think Jesus is doing and help you work with it in your daily lives, we should talk about the fence around the law, the fence around the Torah. So first of all, we should talk about the value of a fence. And to do this, I'm reminded of a story of a hotshot lawyer from New York City who made an amazing name for himself and a very good amount of money, and chose to retire early and buy a farm up in the hinterlands of Maine. And it was a real farm. He was not looking to be a farmer, but he was surrounded by real farmers who did real farming, including some apple orchards. And next door to him, in fact, was a farmer, an elderly gentleman who had a series of apple trees in his backyard that was right next to our retired lawyer's next yard, and there was a big fence there. And one of this farmer's apple trees, because he had been doing this a long time, the apple trees had grown to amazing height and amazing width, and a couple of branches from his tree happened to hang over the fence and over the lawyer's yard, the retired lawyer's yard. So one day, the retired lawyer looks out and he realizes some of these apples have just fallen into his yard, and they've just fallen, so they're still good enough to eat or to cook with or whatever. So he just strolls out into his backyard with a sack and starts scooping up the apples, at which point, here comes the farmer from next door saying, hey, those are my apples. It's my tree. It's my yard. It's my fence. And the lawyer, being a lawyer, says, well, we could argue from a legal standpoint that this is my yard and the apples are hanging over the fence in my yard and they've dropped onto my grass. At which point the farmer replies, yeah, we don't do that courtroom stuff up here in Maine. What we do is the 3-kick rule. Some of you are familiar with it. And the lawyer is not familiar with it, so he says, what's the deal with the 3-kick rule? And the farmer goes, look, each one of us gets a chance to kick the other 3 times, and whichever one is in better shape at the end of this wins. And the lawyer's looking at the farmer, who looks to be, in his 80s maybe, and he's like, yeah, I think I've got the edge. So they do a little rock, paper, scissors. The farmer gets the first kick, the first series of 3 kicks. So he actually climbs over the fence, which is already worrying the lawyer a little bit. and rears back and kicks the farmer in the foot, at which point the farmer realizes this guy has steel-toed work boots on. And he's smarting a little, but he's still standing upright. He's ready to go. He says, okay, give it your best shot, sport. And the farmer rears back and kicks him just below the knee. And at this point, that's smarts. And the lawyer's like, okay, I can do this. Third kick. And at this point, for the sake of knowing the fact that we are in a house of worship, all I will say is the farmer rears back and kicks him a bit higher. At which point the lawyer doubles over, loses his breath, almost loses his consciousness, almost loses his lunch, can't see straight, finally stands back up and says, okay, my turn. At which point the farmer replies, you can keep the apples. And I told this in class, believe it or not, and the response I got was enlightening, because immediately one of my students, probably an urban planning major, goes, well, this could have all been avoided if the farmer had had the tree in the middle of his yard and not let the branches get to the other neighbor's yard. And then another of my students, I don't know what his major was, raises his hand and goes, and it would have been better if he had like 2 or 3 fences around it. And that way it wouldn't have even been an issue and none of this would have happened. It would have been avoided from the start. And this, my friends, is how Jesus is operating. This is what we call the fence around the law. And in order to understand how this works, just a quick piece of Jewish law that you're probably all familiar with is what we call the kosher dietary restriction. If you know any Jewish friends who are what we would call observant or practicing, you notice there are certain things they will not eat. The most obvious one is no pork. The next obvious one is no shellfish. Now, what you may not know is one of the other kosher laws that is observed if you're observant is no meat and no dairy on the same dish, ever. And you may say to yourself, is that a biblical law? Well, not exactly. The biblical law goes like this. And this is from Exodus, the 23rd chapter, 19th verse. I gotcha. It's not on the screen. Bring the best of the first fruits of your soil to the house of the Lord your God. That's not the law in question. Here it is. Do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. Well, you may ask yourself, how do we get from the biblical guideline, which is don't cook a goat in its mother's milk, to don't eat chicken parmesan? Right? Now, some of you may have a farming background, so if you have ever milked a chicken, I want to hear about it. Because I've never seen the need for that, and I don't think it exists. And this is what Jesus is doing when he says, you've heard it said, don't murder, but I say, the moment you get angry, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery, but Jesus says, what I say is, the moment you think inappropriately about your neighbor, it's the fence that Jesus is using. Jesus is using a big fence. And to illustrate this point in our daily lives, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. You don't have to raise your hand. Tyler actually said he feels that he sometimes can ask you questions right here. So we'll see. But you just answer internally if you wish. You don't have to raise your hand. So over the last month, anybody willfully murdered another human being? Yeah, don't overthink it. Okay, I'm going with no. Now, how about this one? Over the last month, anybody roll through a stop sign? Oh, some people just, yes. It's like, over the past month, has anybody raised their voice at an athletic event? Or even at a televised one? Come on. Yeah. This would be the moment where I point out I'm from UC and check to see if there are any Xavier basketball fans in the crowd, but I'm a bigger man than that. Third, over the past month, has anybody sort of raised their voice, so to speak, on social media? Facebook, Twitter, something like that. I see some smiles. So here's the thing. You might say at this point to yourself, sure, I have indeed Hollywooded a stop sign here and there. How could that possibly amount to killing someone? Well, it doesn't. But let me tell you a story, a true story. About 7 weeks ago, I'm driving through Covington, Kentucky. Stop sign, not even a stop sign, a stoplight. Red, turns to green. I wait a couple seconds. I start going, and someone in a minivan comes through at about 50 miles an hour. They've had the red light. They ran that red light with so much forethought that they actually came behind me after putting on their brakes. Had this gone 5 feet in either direction, I would not be with you today. Pure and simple, because they were coming from the driver's side. Now, that person, I'm sure, did not think that moment, I've never actually tried running a stoplight at 50 miles an hour. Let me give it a shot. What the heck? No, at some point, years before that, they started rolling stop signs. And it got good to them, and little by little, they felt less and less bound by the guidelines of society and common sense. And sure enough, at one point, they just had to get to work, and they thought, here you go. Same thing in terms of an athletic event. You may think, oh, come on, we all scream at a referee or maybe someone on the opposing squad now and then. I have certainly been guilty of it back in my son's basketball playing career, but I will never forget the 8th grade Kentucky State Championship in 8th, which I would point out Holmes won, and our son was the point guard. It's another kind of UC thing. The point was we had a really difficult game in the middle of it with a team that got more and more frustrated with us. It was a close game. Their parents started yelling a lot and started using racial terms in their yells. And, it was sort of, you could sort of say, yeah, yelling is yelling, okay? We got out of there as fast as we could. This being a tournament, we had another game 30 minutes away. We went straight to it. And sure enough, I ended up sitting with parents from the new opposing team who were very charitable and fun. And I kind of said, yeah, this is so different from the other game we just played. And she goes, yeah, I heard. And I said, how would you hear? She goes, well, our school is right next to theirs. You may not know this, but they just jumped the referees in the parking lot right after your game. Yeah. Social media, same thing. You may go, what could come of it if you use a nasty tone on Facebook? Well, a friend of mine apparently got into one of those arguments on Facebook, and it ended with the opponent finding out where my friend lived and posting it on Facebook and saying, hey, why don't we settle this argument at your house? And then he listed the address and said, hey, are you still married to so-and-so? This is public record. So if you don't stop it at some point, how far will it go? And Jesus is saying, you know where the best place to stop it is? At the beginning. At the beginning. He's not assuming you will walk out and kill someone over a beef involving property or sports or even politics. But what he is saying is the moment you start getting angry about things is the moment to check yourself. That's the moment. Don't let it get 5 steps down the road. Don't think you can sort of muddle your way into an angry exchange and then never go further. He says, you don't know. Where's the place to stop? At the beginning. To avoid doing harm, to honor your fellow human beings the way God would have us honor our fellow human beings. Don't wait until it gets to the point where it's even halfway to violence, or halfway to anger, or halfway to a word that you can't take back. If you feel attracted to someone and it is an inappropriate attraction, that's the place to check yourself. Don't go out saying if you want to go out for a cup of coffee and think, yeah, we'll figure it out later. Jesus says, no. Stop before you start. And then you have just assured yourself you will never kill someone, and you will never get caught in an inappropriate relationship because you didn't let it get rolling at all. So I would say consider this. Yeah, maybe it sounds hardcore when Jesus says, you've heard that you shouldn't murder. You've heard that you shouldn't get caught you shouldn't engage in adultery. But I say to you, don't even get angry. That's the path to judgment. Don't even think inappropriately about your neighbor's property or spouse or any of that. That is the path to judgment, harsh judgment. You took my advice. You dropped something a couple of minutes before I stopped. Perfect. Hey, he's in the booth. I guess everybody can do it now. So consider this. If you make a point of practicing this lifestyle, of stopping at every stop sign for 2 or 3 seconds, well, I'll admit it, probably someone behind you will get upset. If you make a point of not hollering at the officials at an athletic event when another parent on your team feels that your team has been given a bum rap, they may wonder about you, okay, about your commitment to the team or to the sport. If you choose to actually compliment someone on their passion during a Facebook argument instead of going at them at an escalating level of anger, they may just think you're slap crazy. What they will probably think, although they may not use the term, is that you are somewhat hardcore about this, about being peaceful, about avoiding what can be the ultimate end of certain conflicts. They may, in fact, think of you as hardcore. And what I would suggest is that's okay. Because according to Jesus, if you're hardcore, you're in pretty good company.